the Emeritus Academy. And here to present those certificates today is our Vice Provost in the Office of Academic Affairs, Helen Malone. And Helen was gracious enough to come by to present these to everybody, and I've asked her to say a few words first.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And hello, everybody. One of the things I love about coming and actually engaging in this presentation, I guess twice a year we do this, is that I see all of the Emeritus Academy requests come in through my queue that I sign. And the longer I've been in this role, the more I know people who are coming through. And so I get to come and I get to see people that I know, and I find it to be quite enjoyable. You're joining the Emeritus Academy. Those are our new members today. Joining the Emeritus Academy has been around for 11 years, if I've done my math correctly. And it's an institution that is now being replicated at other Big Ten institutions, which is fantastic, right? How people are looking to Ohio State to say, how do we emulate the work that you all are doing with your emeritus faculty and the work as a university, but the work that you continue to do, you represent the university in the best possible ways. And we're so grateful for your continued engagement, and we're glad that we're able to support this. So on behalf of the provost, I'm thrilled to be here to be able to welcome our newest members to the Emeritus Academy.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, we have some certificates to present. We're going to start with the people that we're pretty sure are here today. There's also some who are attending via Zoom up top, and a few that I don't believe are here, but correct me if I'm wrong at the end. So first, if you would come up and receive your certificate, Richard Burry, Department of Neuroscience in the College of Medicine. Dr. Burry, congratulations.
I'm just trying to not
rest.
Hold.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Next is Gloria Galloway from the Department of Neurology in the College of Medicine. Next is Eric Kraut from the Department of Hematology in the College of Medicine. Next is Greg Rose from the Department of Geography, College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you. Next is Mark Rudolph from the School of Music in the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you, sir. Pedro Weissleiter. I know I said that wrong, Pedro. I'm sorry. Department of Pediatrics, College of Medicine. Good to see you. And the last one that we know is here in person, or think is here, is Thomas Wells from the School of Music in the College of Arts and Sciences. Tom, are you on Zoom by any chance? No. Okay. Attending via Zoom, we believe, Curtis Haltvet, Marketing and Logistics, Fisher College of Business. Also, Thomas Rausch from the College of Optometry. And possibly Herman Shen from the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering in the College of Engineering. So those who I believe were unable to attend, Brian Joseph, Department of Linguistics, College of Arts and Sciences. Robert Lee, Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, College of Engineering. And one I know is not here is Bernadette Melnick from the College of Nursing. So let's give a hand for everybody today that's been elected. And thank you for coming and presenting, Helen. Appreciate it. All right. So we have a talk today. Dr. Tom Wickizer is Professor Emeritus in the College of Public Health. Formerly, he was the college's Stephen F. Loeb's Distinguished Professor of Health Services Management and Policy and Chair of the Division of Health Services Management and Policy. He joined the faculty at Ohio State in October of 2009. He received his PhD in 1989 from the University of Michigan. His primary areas of study were health economics, health policy, and health services research. From 89 through 09, he served on the faculty at the University of Washington School of Public Health, taught courses in health economics, health services organization and policy, and health services research. In 97, he was awarded the Rom Haas Distinguished Professorship of Public Health Sciences for his research. He's published widely in the areas of health economics, health outcomes, and quality improvement. He continued research in those areas after coming to Ohio State. More recently, his work has focused on two serious public health problems: unintentional fentanyl overdose, which you may remember he talked to us about, I think it was last year, wasn't it? And firearm suicide. And we are going to hear about gun violence in America today. Thank you, Dr. Wickizer.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Yeah, that's on. Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's always great to be back in Columbus in the spring, although some of the people we met, our old friends the last couple of days, asked if I brought the nice weather for the last 2 days from Seattle. I assured them, no, I hadn't done that intentionally, but it's nice that it's a nicer day today. So what I'm going to talk about is it is, and it will continue to be, unfortunately, a very serious public health problem. Gun violence takes far too many lives each year, especially among children and adolescents, as we'll see. And the country over time has really vacillated in its, especially in the last 20, 30 or so years, in its approach to the problem. And I'm going to talk more about that. So I want to just acknowledge the financial support that the Academy provided me to help hire a research assistant, Rachel Mason. Rachel, are you here? Oh, there she is in the front row. I should have seen you. Yeah, she's a doctoral student and does great work and has been very helpful. So just a preface to my talk. I started actually my career in public health way back when, which will probably date my age a little bit, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana. And I was fortunate enough to have a special assignment at a United Nations Development Program site, which is at the base of Lake Volta. It's actually the largest artificial lake in the world. It's about 270 miles long and up to 40 miles wide. And at that time, WHO was probably about the third year in their worldwide smallpox eradication campaign. And they pretty much finished. CDC had a contract, or not a contract, really an agreement with WHO to take over and support the eradication program in 20 West African and Central African countries. And so I managed a medical field unit team on the lake. The task or the mission was to go by boat and vaccinate the fishing villages, because in many of the villages, the only way to get in and out was by boat. So we gave smallpox, measles, and depending on where we were, yellow fever. And I think as many people here know, the eradication of smallpox is viewed widely as a historic public health achievement. But my question, the next line is, could we achieve similar success in combating the gun violence epidemic? And the answer that I have is it's very unlikely, mainly because of the politics of gun safety and gun regulations. But the majority of the public, including gun owners, supports wants improved gun safety. It's just a matter of moving the needle a bit among the politicians. So the topics I'm going to give an overview and some background, and then talk a little bit about our OSU research I did with a couple of our doctoral students looking at mental health and firearm suicide, and then present some data sort of from a high level. I'm not going to get into the weeds really on death rates and trends in firearm homicide, suicide, and a little bit of information on the health and economic impact. And then wrap up making a few comments on the politicization of gun violence and the policy confusion that seems to exist. Okay, gun violence, what is it? I think of gun violence really as a homegrown, man-made epidemic. We're really, as you'll see in a couple slides, really the only high-income country in the world that has this kind of problem. There's no other country that comes close to this kind of problem. So it's really unique to the US. Combating the epidemic, what would it require? I think it will require, and I don't pass myself off on an expert really on this topic. I'll tell you in a minute or so how I became interested in it, but there are people who spent their careers studying this, and I am not one of them. But I think this is generally accepted, is that it really will require new political will and a new outlook on what freedom and the Second Amendment mean. I'll talk some more about that later. And I think in the current political climate, there's really little chance for meaningful progress, unfortunately. Types of firearm violence. There's really, I suppose you could put them in three buckets. One is firearm suicide, one is firearm homicide, and one is mass shootings, which the definition is, I'm not sure there's unanimous agreement on this, but I think most people define it now as 4 or more persons shot in a single incident, not necessarily killed, but shot. So some background data, what's the magnitude of the problem? These data are for 2023. There are almost 18,000 deaths due to firearm homicide. More deaths, about 9,000, a little bit more than 9,000 additional deaths due to firearm suicide, 27,000 out of a total of about 49,000 total suicides. So somewhat more than half of all suicides are firearm suicides. 656 mass shootings, 712 deaths, about 2,700 injuries, 10 school shootings. There were roughly 36,000 and some firearm injuries. I don't know how many of those were serious enough to require hospitalization, but probably a fair proportion, I would guess. 14 million guns were bought, and in the United States, as best we can count, there are about 300 million guns owned, actually more guns than people. Many people that own a gun, though, own more than one gun. I can't tell the average number of those people that own guns, but it's probably in the area of 3 to 5 or 6 or so. The scope of the gun violence problem. In 2015, the firearm death rate in the US was about 11.4 times greater than the rate in 28 high-income countries. Those would be mainly European Union countries, probably as well as Australia, Japan. I'm not sure about Taiwan, but so predominantly European countries and a couple of Asian countries. 11 times greater than 28 high-income countries combined. Over 91% of women and 92% of youth, age 15 to 24, killed by guns in all high-income countries were U.S. women and U.S. youth, which I find that just remarkable. Human and economic cost of gun violence certainly includes premature mortality, reduced productivity due to morbidity, medical care costs, criminal justice costs, law enforcement costs. And then the third bullet there, we really have not been able to quantify it, but I think indirect and intangible costs of gun violence for individual families and communities is very, very large. I mean, you can just imagine the intangible cost to a 6-year-old girl whose mother is killed by gun violence, or a 10-year-old boy whose father is killed by gun violence. And there are communities, in some of the major cities where gun violence is just a daily fact of life. And so those kinds of costs to the individuals who incur them are, they're very real. We just haven't been able to quantify them. Some history in gun laws. So many of you probably know, the Second Amendment, which was adopted in 1791, states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A number of scholars feel that what the Second Amendment meant, though, was to really focus on the collective, not the individual's right to bear arms. And it's been through the years, especially over the last 20 years or so, a subject of considerable debate. It continues to be a subject of considerable debate. The gun control debate is now really framed as sort of a zero-sum game. If one side wins, the other side loses. But history really shows otherwise. This wasn't always the case in the country. For the first, 300 years or so, America's existence, gun laws and gun rights went hand in hand. In recent decades, the gun debate, though, has become much more politicized and ideological. I think like other public health issues, 10 or 20 years ago, I never thought vaccination would become a politicized topic, and yet it has. The belief that gun laws are a function of modern industrial America, though, is really incompatible with the history, values, and legal traditions. From colonial times really to the earlier mid-30s and the passage of the first national gun law, the National Firearms Act, there were nearly 1,000 laws enacted covering acquisition, sale, transport, and use of guns. And many of these laws allowed for the confiscation of firearms. States enacted laws in the early 1930s, or earlier, but in the 1930s, barring semi-automatic weapons, and that included Ohio. The Ohio law stated any firearm which shoots automatically or any firearm which shoots more than 18 shots semi-automatically without reloading. Despite views to the contrary, America really has had a long history of gun control aimed at improving public safety. So this isn't something that just emerged in the late 60s after the assassination of Kennedy and his brother and Martin Luther King. But more recent court decisions in state and federal laws have created a complex and really often contradictory and confusing legal landscape that varies from state to state and is subject to change over time based on court decisions, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. So some of the key court decisions and laws, these are by no means an exhaustive list. The Gun Control Act of 1968 provided a framework to limit the purchase and possession of guns for at-risk persons, minors, and felons. The 1986 Firearm Owners Protection Act, that was passed during the Reagan administration, loosened regulations on the sale of guns and lowered penalties for gun sale violations. Then in 1996, the Dickey Amendment was passed, which prohibited use of CDC funds to advocate or promote gun control and basically ended federal funding for research on gun violence prevention. It was rescinded, I can't give you the exact year, but fairly recently, I think within the last 5 to 7 years. 1994 was the Brady Act. It passed in response to the 1981 assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, and it mandated background checks. So after the attempted assassination, it took 13 years to get some meaningful legislation through Congress. Two more recent Supreme Court decisions. One was the 2008 Columbia versus Heller, that the court decision protected persons' rights to own a gun in their home. And more importantly, was the 2022 New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Brune case that struck down the New York concealed carry licensing law, but also, importantly, instructed courts to use text, history, and tradition to assess the constitutionality of gun laws. And it argued that the burden of gun regulation places on the right to carry a firearm should not be balanced against benefits society would gain from the regulation's public safety benefits. And for me, that's a little hard to get from A to B in the reasoning, but that was the court's decision. It was a key decision and fundamentally changed how we assess the constitutionality of gun laws. States have passed laws both restricting and loosening gun regulations, and it should probably come as no surprise that in quote unquote red states, they tend to be looser in gun regulations, and in blue states, they tend to be more restrictive. So selected key court decisions and laws, ending with the 2022 Safer Communities Act passed during the Biden administration. It was bipartisan gun reform that was passed after the Robb Elementary school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. It was the first gun reform law passed since the Brady Bill way back in 1994. It provided funding to promote red flag laws and funding for programs to improve access to mental health services and secure and hardened schools. Gun violence has taken on two, I wouldn't say opposing, but two different views. One, a public health view, and one more of a public policy view. And the public health framework stresses the social burden of gun violence, favors primary prevention. That's not a surprise. It resists framing gun violence in terms of criminal acts, and it tends not to stress the importance. It's not that it doesn't recognize the importance, but it doesn't stress the importance of criminal justice system in arresting and convicting perpetrators of gun violence. The public policy framework, on the other hand, and it does emphasize gun violence more as a crime, and the importance of the criminal justice system in addressing gun violence crime. But these two views or perspectives are not completely opposed. And there's a group up at Harvard in the Injury Prevention Center run by David Hemingway. They tend to stress the public health approach. There are a couple of people in a program down at Duke, and I forget, I want to say Philip Cook, but I'm not totally sure about that, who's done a lot of the work in the public policy framework, but they're not completely opposed. So a few comments on our OSU research. Probably as many of you here have had the experience, and it's really one of the things that makes worth working at a university. And that's working with graduate students on a project. Graduate students have endless energy, and including Rachel here in the front seat. And so, as I'll say in a minute here, I got interested in this topic after the Sandy Hook mass shooting in Connecticut in 2012. And I'll say some more about that. But I had a chance to work closely with two of our PhD students that finished. One is now an assistant professor out in the Department of Population Health Sciences at the University of Utah Medical School. And the other actually went out to the University of Washington to work in the Injury Prevention Center, but came back, and she's now an assistant professor in my old division. So they both have launched their careers very successfully. So after mass shootings, not always, but very frequently, this question would arise: are mass shootings fundamentally a mental health problem or a failure of gun safety laws and regulations? And those two obviously are not mutually exclusive. But that, I don't know, argument or debate has gone back and forth. And obviously, if somebody walks into a school and shoots students and teachers, that person has a very serious mental health problem. There's no question about that. But then the question arises, well, how were they able to get the gun? And could that have possibly been prevented? So, as I mentioned earlier, after the Sandy Hook shooting, I became interested and started working with some doctoral students. And the key question I wanted to examine is, would greater access to mental health services reduce firearm suicide? And I didn't have a grant for this work, so it had to be based on publicly available data, which fortunately there were data publicly available. So these are 4 publications that we got, and Evan Goldstein was the lead author on 3 of them. The first one looked at behavioral health care and firearm suicide, looking at, do states with greater treatment capacity have lower suicide rates? And then I did a paper for The Conversation. How many of you have heard of The Conversation? No? Well, it's interesting. It's an online outlet. It was developed by about 25 universities some time ago, including Ohio State. It's one of the founding universities of it. And it was intended to provide an outlet or a platform for academic research to get into the public. They publish social science, work on natural sciences, commentaries. It's I found it very interesting. And in our case, there must have been a dozen newspapers that picked up our findings because they saw it in the Conversation. And then we had a paper that was a commentary in the Annals of Family Medicine, titled "The Firearm Crisis: Physicians Can Play a More Active Role." And then the last paper, more recently, was published in 2022 in the Journal of Adolescent Health, titled "Preventing Adolescent and Young Adult Suicide: Do States with Greater Mental Health Treatment Capacity Have Lower Suicide Rates?" So I'm not going to get into the weeds at all on methods and data, but we constructed state-level time series cross-section databases. The explanatory variable was based on Bureau of Labor Statistics data. What we did is we went into the BLS database and extracted information on mental health workforces for each state in selected years, including clinical and counseling school psychologists, substance abuse and behavioral disorder counselors, mental health counselors, medical and public health, social workers, and psychiatrists and psychiatric aides. And we tested standard fixed effects regression models. So what did we find? We found that increasing the behavioral health workforce, or the mental health workforce, the same thing, had a small effect on the firearm suicide rate. These are for adults, so people 18 and older. A 10% increase in the behavioral health workforce was associated with a relative 1.2 decrease in the firearm suicide rate. There was no, not surprisingly, there was no effect found on total suicide rate. There was a small inverse relationship between educational attainment and firearm suicide rate. And as part of this piece I did for the conversation, I estimated what it would take in terms of an investment to save one life in Ohio. And as best we could tell, it would require about a $15 million investment, which obviously is not practical. That's not to say that we don't need and continue to need an expanded mental health workforce. We absolutely do. It's just that if the strategy is let's increase the size of the mental health workforce in order to reduce the firearm suicide rate, that's not a practical strategy, at least based on our data. More recently, the adolescent firearm suicide work, we found an inverse relationship between non-firearm suicide and mental health treatment capacity, such that a 10% increase in a state's mental health treatment capacity was associated with about a 1.4 relative reduction in the non-firearm suicide rate among persons 10 to 24. We didn't find any relationship with firearm suicide. But firearm suicide tends to be, and again, I'm not an expert at all on suicide, but from my reading of the literature, tends to be oftentimes a very impulsive act. And so it doesn't allow one perhaps that's taken in excess of pills and ends up in the ER and then gets into the mental health system. So we did find this is small, but not trivial, I guess you might say, a factor relationship between the non-firearm suicide and the mental health treatment capacity. And we found, again, an inverse relationship between educational attainment and non-firearm and total suicide rate. And this last bullet made me think, and I was hoping to get done in time to say something in this presentation, but life got in the way. This was a surprisingly strong finding, even though we had a crude measure of educational attainment. And there's publicly available data by state on the per capita expenditure for both instructional staff and non-instructional staff, K through 12. And so I still intend to create a database looking at that and some social capital variables to see if that has an effect on either firearm suicide or firearm homicide. So some data on trends and patterns. Here's data from 2000 to 2023, showing the increase in total firearm deaths and the corresponding increase in suicide, that's the gold line, and homicide deaths. And so you can see, I think as I mentioned before, there was, in terms of total deaths, homicide and suicide, 45,227 in 2023, and that represented a 65% increase over the number of deaths in 2000. This is a figure that's not based on data I collected, and I should have had a reference for it, but I don't. But it's death rates for children and adolescents age 1 to 19, and you can see how the the blue line is a motor vehicle crashes coming way down, and then plateauing, and then down again, and then slightly upward. And here's the firearm suicide. It really started climbing about 2013. And then that's where it was in 2020, the last data point in this series. But I had access to data from 21 to 23, and the firearm, the firearm related death rate increased to 7 per 100,000, whereas the motor vehicle crash death rate stayed pretty much constant at about 5.7. And these are some of the other causes of death among children and adolescents: malignant neoplasm, suffocation, heart disease. But you can see that the firearm death by firearm related injury is substantially higher than these other causes of death. Here's data again, trends over time, 2000 to 2023. These are rates, so death rates per 100,000. And you can see that the male homicide rate is highest. That's the male suicide rate in purple. And then the female suicide rate and the female homicide rate are substantially lower, although their relative increases were actually greater for females than males. So in general, there's been, an upward trend over time in both the firearm homicide and firearm suicide for both males and females. These are adolescents, though, age 15 to 29. I have another slide, and that I'll talk about later, but the gun violence epidemic, I use that term, really is affects different population groups in different geographic areas differently. So the slide shows white versus African American in terms of male and female homicide and suicide, and you can see that the gold bar there for African Americans, that's the homicide rate is almost, it's 90 something per 100,000, substantially. Again, these are young people, adolescents and young people aged 15 to 29. And that reflects probably inner city urban gun violence, along with gun violence in southern states. And you can see also a difference for females, white versus African American for homicide. Less of a difference in the suicide rates. So these are states just showing you the highest and lowest firearm death rates. So this combines suicide and homicide. And you can see the District of Columbia, these are for 2023, that's the latest year data are available, was 30.6 per 100,000. Mississippi is almost the same. Louisiana, 28.3. Alabama, 25.6. The median state is 15, to give you a point of reference. And then some of these East Coast states, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, are substantially less. And I don't have a ready explanation for that. I think probably that certainly the Mid-Atlantic and New England states there with the low rates have probably more restrictive gun laws compared to the southern states And I'm a little uncertain about how restrictive the laws are in the District of Columbia. So there's a lot of variation across states and across population groups. This is sort of combined states at the census division level. Again, it's basically the same data. And you can see the top bar is the East South Central division that consists of Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama with 23.2. These are all people, they're not just young people. The mountain states, the death rate is about 18. And then you go down the Pacific, California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, less 9.3, New England down at 6.2. So again, we see a lot of variation across larger aggregates, larger geographic aggregates. These are data showing the firearm mortality rate for white males, older white males, 55 to 84. And again, you can see a large difference between the western states, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, less restrictive gun laws, and some of the East Coast states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. This is a slide that compares the fentanyl, the death rate, and well, it shows fentanyl firearm deaths as well as fentanyl deaths, and then the rates in parentheses. And you can see in 2000 and 2010, the number of firearm deaths and the rate were substantially much higher than fentanyl. But by 2023, fentanyl certainly had overtaken gun violence as a cause of death. In fact, if my memory serves me right, fentanyl is now the #1 cause of death for people 18 to 45. Ohio had the greatest years of life lost and economic loss due to fentanyl in 2022 of any state. And why that may be hard to believe, there was 3,924 deaths due to fentanyl in Ohio. I don't recall the years of life lost. I recently wrote a op-ed piece for the Columbus Dispatch talking about this, and but noting that the death rate in 2023 in Ohio has come down by 11%, which is good news. But it appears that they didn't like what I had to say. So that probably won't. I might send it up to the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I don't know. So estimating years of life lost and economic loss, mortality rates, you all know, are commonly used as a health outcome measure, but they provide somewhat of an incomplete picture of the impact of illness and events when persons dying are young or middle-aged. So I calculated years of life lost, which is a basic measure. So if you die at 20, of a gun violence, you're going to lose so many years of life lost. And you can use Social Security life tables to estimate that. Economic loss, we did, we have a paper now under review on the fentanyl epidemic, and we used state level on GDP data, their economic output, gross domestic product at the state level, adjusted for labor force participation, and we calculated the present values of economic losses. And I won't get too much further into those details. But just to give you a sense, you can see that the years of life lost are greatest among, this is males for gun violence from what, age 15 to 44. And those are the estimated economic losses. The total number of years of life lost for males that died, the 38,000 some males, was 1.4 million. And the estimated cost in terms of lost productivity. So if somebody dies at age 20, society loses the benefit of their productivity. They don't pay taxes and they don't consume and they don't produce goods and services. It's about 35 billion. This is the same data for females, not surprisingly, substantially less, about 266,000 years of life lost, and at a cost, estimated cost of about 5.4 billion. So as I said before, the risk of firearm death really varies across geographic areas and population groups. Older white males in the West, for example, younger Black males in inner cities in southern states. And so I think what we need, and I've said this in our work on fentanyl, the fentanyl epidemic, is data-driven intervention approaches based on known risk factors. And gun reform laws and public health intervention should be based on the best prevention science and public policy knowledge. I'm not sure that's always the case, but we really do need data-driven intervention approaches, because you can't have just laws at the federal level that assume kind of the one size fits all. There are different known risk factors for different population groups and in different geographic areas. And obviously, if you're going to be successful taking a prevention approach, you need to consider those risk factors. Okay, a few more slides. Recent actions of the Trump administration, it has taken recent actions to roll back gun control in the name of the Second Amendment. Donald Trump is very clear about that. In February, he signed an executive order directing the Department of Justice to examine all orders, regulations, guidance plans, and other actions to assess any ongoing infringements of the Second Amendment rights of our citizens. Later in March, Attorney General Pam Bondi ordered the Department of Justice to open an investigation into potential infringement of the Second Amendment rights by officials in Los Angeles County. Again, Attorney General Bondi has ordered Kash Patel, who's now the acting director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, to review two major policies enacted under the Biden administration, banning pistol braces used to convert handguns into rifle-like weapons, and the rule regulating background checks on private gun sales. So there's little doubt in my mind that gun control in the US will become weaker in the next several years, at least at the federal level. So to summarize in the last couple of slides, gun control is a highly politicized issue. The country, I think it's fair to say, and probably all of you know, remains deeply divided about a path forward. Access to firearms is a known key factor associated with more firearm suicides and homicides. And the question is, how in practical ways can we limit access to firearms? But then when you start thinking about that, then you run into the whole issue of the Second Amendment and people's freedom to bear arms. And so that, at least at the moment, is not going very far. The legal landscape is complex and contradictory. The public, as I said, is sharply divided on gun control. 56% in the latest Gallup poll want stricter gun laws, but 88% of the Democrats favor stricter gun laws, is what I alluded to earlier, versus 26% of the Republicans. On the other hand, 86% of the Republicans believe guns make homes safer versus 37% of the Democrats. The current Trump administration is rolling back gun regulation in favor of Second Amendment rights. We'll see how far that goes. It's yet to be seen. So I think the unfortunate, I don't know, news is that I think gun violence is likely to continue to exact a very heavy toll on Americans. So thank you, and I'll certainly be happy to take questions.
So we have reasonable time for questions. I have one microphone. Whoever wants to. Jack, you have another? Yeah. So first up.
Thank you. Hi, Steve Steinberg here. First of all, that was a great talk. I appreciate it very much. Very depressing. I ran the trauma program at OSU for a long time, so spent a lot of my career trying to work on gun violence, and I'm sad to say made, I guess, negative contribution. It's very frustrating, and it's interesting when one considers the underlying kind of legal opinions and politics of it, particularly the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment, because there's probably just as many constitutional scholars who conclude that the Second Amendment really means something totally different than what we're practicing.
Yeah.
I was wondering, could you discuss that a little bit?
Well, I don't claim to have deep knowledge or expertise there, but I think that just frankly, on a freshman college common sense level, getting from the Second Amendment to where we are today, to me, I don't know how you get from A to B myself. And I think there are, well, the data, the polling data speak for themselves. There's, a sizable proportion of Americans that continue in the courts so far, certainly the Supreme Court, but it's a conservative Supreme Court, tend to give a lot of deference to how they interpret the Second Amendment in terms of, people's right to carry arms and purchase semi-automatic weapons, and I don't see that changing. And I'm not anti-guns. When I was growing up in Minneapolis, when I was, I don't know, 15 or so, I had a .22 rifle. I had a 20 gauge shotgun for pheasant hunting, and a pellet gun. So I wasn't, I'm not anti-guns by any means. And interestingly, one of the best training courses I ever had was when I was about that age, and I couldn't drive because my dad, I remember, taking me Tuesday nights to the basement of this church somewhere in Minneapolis area. And it was a course for kids, adolescents, on gun safety put on by the NRA. And it was absolutely terrific. Now, I don't know if the NRA is still doing that today. I'd be surprised, but maybe they are. But another question. Yeah.
Gun control, the focus is always on the Second Amendment. And I'm wondering, in our, recently we had that there was a case in Michigan where the family was held responsible for a child shooting at a school. And I'm wondering why maybe this is really silly concept, but why don't we have draconian laws regarding the illegal use of a gun? So when somebody commits a crime with a gun, like I said, draconian, that there would be tremendous pain associated with that would eventually, maybe it would filter down in society over time, but it would be so painful that it might discourage people. Maybe that's very incredibly naive, but I always think, it seems like in this country, the Republicans pray when there's mass killing, and the Democrats say we need gun control. And neither of those approaches, as you pointed out, are working right now. Why don't we have draconian law? I think both Democrats and Republicans would agree that perhaps you mentioned that there is an interest in gun control in both parties. But why don't we take it from a different approach rather than the Second Amendment? Because the Second Amendment is sacred in this country and it's never going to change. But we waste our time talking about it all the time. Why don't we take another approach?
Well, so I don't know that I've tracked all your comments. I think the case in Michigan, and I think that's already gone to court and the parents were convicted of manslaughter, is my understanding. It happened in, I think, Pontiac, a suburb of Detroit. And to my knowledge, that was about the first time when parents were actually convicted of, I don't want to say being accessories, but being really lax in their control of a gun in the house. We do need new thinking, because the problem with this whole issue, in my mind, again, I have no legal training whatsoever, but with this Second Amendment issue and the whole emphasis on freedom, meaning freedom to carry guns of any sort in many states, is really getting us nowhere. But in many states, and certainly the federal government right now and in Congress, there's no appetite at all to do. I think it would have to take a substantial change in the public's view of gun violence and changing that view into political action. And I don't know, again, and I'm not a political scientist, so I'm out of my element, but I don't see that happening. I don't think we have. Now, it is happening in some states, and so, one can compare, but they're, the red states just have absolutely no appetite for that at all. And perhaps, I don't know, some of the problem is the public in those states is just unaware of the consequences of the laws on the books in terms of gun violent deaths that they experience for their children and their adolescents and their adults. But I don't know, frankly, if that would even move the needle. I don't have. And there are people doing good work. There's an organization. Every town, I've talked to the guy who runs it. It's Every Town Something. And they have developed, they're sort of an advocacy group for gun control and gun safety. And they've done some good work and hold a couple times a year, national conferences that people call into, and they're very thoughtful in their approach. But I just don't see that catching on in the.
We have another question over here.
Yes. So is there research on the correlation between income inequality and gun violence? You could do comparison within a country, between different states, and between different developed countries, because certainly inequality in the US is much greater than in many of the other developed countries. Is that as important as the laws?
Well, I have not seen, which is not to say that it doesn't exist. I haven't seen data on that and published findings, but my guess would be that you would find, well, we included in our models, I don't know if we included unemployment rate or the average income of the state. We didn't find an effect, but I completely agree with you that you would expect some relationship. It's not all a matter of gun laws. It's some of these environmental conditions, in particular, income inequality, for one, lack of social capital, perhaps for another. Yeah.
There was you had one sentence up there about differing beliefs among the two political parties in home safety and gun ownership. And it's, I think, one of the few things where we actually have some data on that, but I don't know exactly what it is. Um, is, are people safer in homes because they own guns or not?
Well,
Well, what's the data say? We all have beliefs, but what does the data say?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So and I don't know the breakdown between gun ownership in the home and firearm suicide and firearm homicide, but you're absolutely right. People that have guns in the home experience higher gun fatality. That's known. Yeah.
I thought one of the things that the public agreed on after mass shootings, time and time again, you get these super high numbers of universal background checks, red flag laws being advocated. And I think a big problem is not so much the public as how the NRA and the legislators want to politicize this. My recollection is after the Dayton shooting, Governor DeWine was pushing for really mild, insufficient in my mind, measures about gun control. And the GOP wanted none of it. And
They didn't support it, you're saying. In Ohio, the GOP.
absolutely not. They
Yeah.
politicized it.
Yeah, right, right. Yep, yep.
Where we could potentially see common ground with some legislation. Is there any research that can determine how many of the guns in possession that are committing these crimes, including death or suicide, which are those plastic guns made with,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
the AI or website instruction
Yeah.
materials? Is there a way to distinguish or gather that kind of data?
I have not seen data. In fact, I haven't seen data, which is not to say it doesn't exist. I haven't seen data on how many of those guns are out there. I know if you know what you're doing, you can go online and get the parts and put it together and evade any and all controls. Yeah,